January 31st, 1968. Dawn breaks over Hue City, Vietnam. The North Vietnamese flag rises above the ancient citadel's fortress walls, 20 feet high, behind a moat 90 feet wide. American Marines and South Vietnamese forces are trapped, clinging to scattered compounds as the enemy controls the city. Heavy M48 tanks lumber through narrow streets, their 52-ton hulls struggling against thick masonry walls and deadly RPG ambushes at every corner. The army had already given up on their bizarre-looking tank destroyer. Too small, too weird, too many problems. They called it ugly and useless and cancelled their orders entirely. But the Marines took all 297 of them anyway. Now, as conventional armour fails against Hue's ancient stonework, Lieutenant Colonel Ernest Cheatham stares at his most unconventional weapon. 6 recoilless rifles mounted on a vehicle the size of a jeep. The Army's reject was about to become the key to America's most brutal urban battle. What happened next would prove that sometimes the weapon everyone dismisses is exactly what you need when the impossible becomes necessary. Subscribe for more incredible war stories that changed everything. The sound that woke Lieutenant Colonel Ernest Cheatham at 0430 on January 31st, 1968, was not the usual rhythm of artillery fire that had punctuated his sleep for months. This was different, sharper, closer, coming from inside Hue City itself. By the time he reached the radio at his command post 8 miles south at Phu Bai Combat Base, the reports were flooding in. The North Vietnamese had done the impossible. They had taken Hue. The ancient imperial capital sat astride the Perfume River like a jewel split in two. South of the river lay the new city, with its government buildings and the fortified MACV compound, where American advisors coordinated South Vietnamese operations. North of the river rose the citadel, a square fortress nearly 2 miles on each side, surrounded by walls 20 feet high and a moat that stretched 90 feet across and 12 feet deep in places. Inside those walls lay the Forbidden City, the sacred heart of Vietnamese imperial power, and the prize the North Vietnamese now claimed as their own. The morning reports painted a picture of tactical disaster. Golf Company of Cheatham's 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines had fought its way across the Perfume River Bridge under intense fire, expecting to link up with South Vietnamese forces and sweep the enemy from a few isolated pockets. Instead, they found themselves pinned down in brutal street fighting, outnumbered and outgunned by an enemy that had turned every building into a fortress. Captain Chuck Meadows, commanding Golf Company, transmitted a message that would haunt Marine planners for weeks. "We are out of our element here." The enemy had prepared brilliantly. North Vietnamese regulars and Viet Cong forces had infiltrated the city over weeks, positioning weapons and supplies in buildings throughout both sides of Hue. They controlled the high ground, the choke points, and most critically, the narrative. The yellow and red flag of South Vietnam had been torn down from the citadel's towering flagpole. In its place flew the blue and red banner of the National Liberation Front, a symbol visible for miles across the flat Delta country, announcing to the world that the Communists had seized Vietnam's cultural and spiritual center. Cheatham understood immediately what conventional tactics would not solve this problem. The enemy had turned Hue into a maze of interconnected firing positions, using the city's ancient architecture as armor. The citadel's walls had been built in 1804 to withstand siege cannons, massive stone and earth ramparts that laughed at rifle fire and absorbed mortar rounds without effect. Inside the old city, traditional Vietnamese houses presented blank walls to the street, with courtyards hidden behind thick masonry that channeled attacking forces into predetermined kill zones. The Marines' standard urban fighting doctrine assumed wooden structures and thin walls that could be breached with explosives or small arms. But Hue was different. These were stone buildings, brick compounds, and fortress walls that had stood for centuries. When Marine rifle squads tried to advance block by block, they found themselves trapped in narrow alleys with no way to outflank enemy positions embedded in structures that shrugged off everything short of artillery fire. The arrival of M48 Patton tanks should have changed the equation. These 52-ton monsters mounted 90mm guns capable of reducing most buildings to rubble. But the streets of Hue had not been designed for modern armor. Narrow lanes forced the tanks to advance nose-first into ambush positions where North Vietnamese troops waited with B-40 rocket-propelled grenades. The tanks' massive bulk made them sitting targets at street corners, unable to traverse their guns quickly enough to engage threats appearing from multiple directions simultaneously. Worse, the thick masonry walls that protected the enemy also limited the tank's effectiveness. A 90mm high-explosive shell could blow apart a wooden building, but against 2-foot-thick stone walls, it often created impressive craters without opening the clean breach that infantry needed to assault through. The tanks found themselves firing round after round at the same positions, gradually chipping away at masonry, while enemy forces simply moved to other rooms in the same building and continued fighting. By February 2nd, the situation had deteriorated beyond anyone's worst-case planning. The Marines held a few scattered positions south of the river, but remained cut off from South Vietnamese forces in the citadel. Every attempt to advance met withering fire from positions that seemed immune to conventional suppression. The enemy had achieved something unprecedented in the Vietnam War. They had created a static defensive position that American firepower could not easily overwhelm. That afternoon, Cheatham made a decision that would define the battle for Hue. Instead of requesting more of the same weapons that were failing, he began assembling a convoy of equipment that most commanders would have considered obsolete or unsuitable for serious combat. His list included M40 106mm recoilless rifles mounted on M274 mechanical mules, satchel charges packed with C4 explosive, M2 flamethrowers, and tear gas with protective masks for his Marines. Most importantly, he requested every available M50 Ontos in the Marine inventory. The Ontos was, by any conventional measure, exactly what the Army had called it when they cancelled their procurement: ugly and useless. The vehicle looked like someone had welded 6 enormous rifles to a tracked chassis barely larger than a jeep. Its official designation was Tank Destroyer, 106mm gun, motor carriage M50. But everyone simply called it the Ontos, Greek for the thing. The Army had originally ordered it as a lightweight tank destroyer that could be air transported to counter Soviet armor, but a series of design compromises had produced a vehicle that satisfied no one's requirements. The Ontos weighed only 8.6 tons compared to the 52 tons of an M48 tank. Its 6 106mm recoilless rifles could deliver devastating firepower, but only if someone climbed out of the vehicle to reload them manually, a process that left the crew exposed to enemy fire. The Army had tested it extensively and concluded that its disadvantages outweighed its benefits. When they cancelled their orders, the Marine Corps had taken all 297 vehicles, partly because Marines had a reputation for making do with hand-me-down equipment, and partly because no one had a better idea for providing mobile direct fire support to infantry units. Now, as Cheatham studied the tactical problem of Hue, the Ontos' supposed weaknesses began to look like exactly what the situation required. Its small size allowed it to maneuver in streets where M48 tanks could barely turn around. Its light weight meant it could cross bridges and move through areas where heavy armor would break through weakened pavement. Most critically, its 106mm recoilless rifles fired a specialized round called HEP, high explosive plastic, that had been designed specifically for attacking fortifications. Unlike conventional artillery shells that relied on penetration and fragmentation, HEP rounds worked by spreading plastic explosive across a target surface and detonating to create a shockwave that traveled through masonry and concrete. The explosive energy transferred through the wall structure itself, spalling chunks of stone and brick from the far side and creating clean breaches that infantry could assault through. Against the thick walls of Hue, this mechanism promised to be far more effective than the conventional high-explosive rounds that simply cratered the outside surface. Cheatham's insight went beyond the technical capabilities of individual weapons. He was developing a new tactical system that combined the Ontos' precision breaching capability with the suppressive fire of M48 tanks and the close-quarters fighting power of Marines equipped with flamethrowers and demolitions. The concept was simple in theory, but revolutionary in execution. Use the Ontos to create precise breaches in enemy positions at ranges of 300 to 500 yards, then follow up immediately with infantry assault teams while the enemy was still stunned by the initial bombardment. The plan required perfect coordination between multiple weapon systems, each playing a specific role in a carefully choreographed sequence. M48 tanks would provide suppressive fire with their 90mm guns, keeping enemy heads down while the Ontos maneuvered to firing positions. The Ontos would engage specific wall sections with HEP rounds, creating breaches large enough for assault teams. Engineers with satchel charges would widen the breaches if necessary, while flamethrower teams cleared rooms and stairwells that conventional weapons could not reach effectively. Finally, rifle squads would move through the breaches to clear buildings room by room and establish positions for the next phase of the advance. As the convoy of wall-busting equipment rolled north from Pu Bai on February 3rd, Cheatham was betting the lives of his Marines on a tactical concept that had never been tested in combat. The enemy controlled most of Hue and had had days to strengthen their positions. Every building potentially contained prepared fighting positions. Every street corner could hide anti-tank teams. The North Vietnamese had chosen their ground carefully and were prepared to defend it with everything they had. But they had not planned for the Ontos. The weapon that had been rejected by the army as unsuitable for modern warfare was about to prove that sometimes the most unlikely tool becomes indispensable when the mission changes. In the narrow streets and ancient fortifications of Hue, the Marine Corps was about to discover that their ugly, useless tank destroyer was exactly what they needed to turn the tide of America's most brutal urban battle. The first test of Cheatham's unconventional doctrine came at dawn on February 4th, when Gulf Company found itself pinned down 3 blocks from the provincial headquarters building in southern Hue. Captain Chuck Meadows had been staring at the same corner for 6 hours, watching muzzle flashes wink from second-story windows, while his Marines hugged whatever cover they could find in the rubble-strewn street. 2 previous assaults had failed, leaving 4 Marines wounded and the enemy position intact behind walls that absorbed M16 fire like a sponge soaking up water. The building was typical of French colonial construction in Vietnam. Thick masonry walls designed to keep out monsoon rains and tropical heat, with narrow windows positioned to provide excellent fields of fire down the approaches. North Vietnamese forces had reinforced the structure with sandbags and steel plates, creating a fortress that conventional infantry tactics could not crack. Every time Marines tried to advance, automatic weapons fire from multiple positions forced them back to their starting point. Cheatham arrived at the forward command post just after sunrise, bringing with him the first Ontos to reach the city. The vehicle looked absurdly small next to the M48 tank that had been hammering the enemy position without effect for most of the night. Where the tank towered over the street like a steel monument, the Ontos sat low and angular, its 6 rifle barrels giving it the appearance of a mechanical porcupine. The Marines who gathered around it wore expressions of polite skepticism. This odd contraption was supposed to solve problems that a 52-ton tank could not handle. The key to understanding why the Ontos succeeded where heavier weapons failed lay in the precise mechanics of how it engaged targets. Each of the vehicle's 6 106mm recoilless rifles was paired with a 50 caliber M8C spotting rifle that had been carefully calibrated to match the ballistics of the main gun. When the gunner fired the spotting rifle, its tracer round followed exactly the same trajectory that the 106mm round would take, allowing for precise target acquisition at ranges up to 1,100 yards. The process looked deceptively simple. The Ontos crew would maneuver to a position with clear sightlines to the target building, typically 300 to 500 yards away, to minimize the risk from enemy small arms while maintaining accuracy. The gunner would fire a single 50 caliber spotting round, watching through his optical sight as the tracer struck the exact point where the main gun would impact. Within seconds, one of the 106mm rifles would fire its HEP round, sending 6 pounds of plastic explosive to precisely the same location the tracer had marked. What made HEP rounds uniquely effective against the masonry construction of Hue was their mechanism of destruction. Unlike conventional high-explosive shells that created their damage through fragmentation and blast effect, HEP rounds were designed to transfer energy through solid barriers. When the plastic explosive detonated against a wall surface, it sent shockwaves through the masonry structure itself, causing catastrophic spalling on the far side. The result was not just a hole in the wall, but a clean breach 4 meters square that assault teams could move through immediately. The first demonstration of this capability came when Cheatham positioned the Ontos at the end of a side street with a clear angle on the provincial headquarters building. The Marines had been trying to assault this position for 3 days, losing men to withering fire from prepared positions behind reinforced walls. Previous attempts with tank fire had cratered the exterior walls without creating usable breaches, leaving the enemy secure in their fortified rooms. The Ontos gunner took his time with the first shot, adjusting his sight picture and confirming the range with his squad leader. The .50 caliber spotting round struck the building's southeast corner with a sharp crack, sending a puff of brick dust into the morning air. 3 seconds later, the 106mm HEP round hit exactly the same spot with a sound like thunder rolling through the narrow streets. The effect was immediate and devastating. Where moments before there had been a solid masonry wall, now there was a jagged opening large enough for a fire team to assault through. More importantly, the shockwave had travelled through the building's structure, stunning or killing the enemy soldiers positioned in adjoining rooms. For the first time since the battle began, Marines could see daylight through a North Vietnamese strongpoint. But Cheatham's innovation went beyond simply punching holes in walls. He had developed a systematic approach to urban warfare that treated each enemy position as a problem requiring multiple solutions applied in precise sequence. The Ontos provided the initial breach, but success depended on following up immediately with the right combination of weapons and tactics to exploit the opening. The assault team that moved through the breach created by the Ontos carried equipment specifically selected for close-quarters fighting in confined spaces. Engineers brought satchel charges packed with C4 explosive to widen breaches or blast through interior walls that blocked movement between rooms. Flamethrower teams carried M2 weapons capable of filling stairwells and enclosed spaces with burning napalm, forcing enemy soldiers to abandon positions that conventional weapons could not reach effectively. The rifle squads that followed carried M16 rifles for precision shooting and M60 machine guns for suppressive fire, but they also brought specialized ammunition for urban fighting. M79 grenade launchers proved particularly effective for engaging enemy positions in upper-story windows, while 40mm high-explosive rounds could clear rooms that would be too dangerous to assault with small arms alone. The coordination required to make this system work effectively demanded split-second timing and perfect communication between multiple weapon systems. M48 tanks provided suppressive fire during the approach phase, using their 90mm guns to keep enemy heads down, while the Ontos maneuvered to firing positions. Once the Ontos fired its breach-creating rounds, the tanks would shift to firing canister rounds, massive shotgun shells that swept streets clear of enemy infantry, while assault teams moved through the newly created openings. Radio communication proved critical to the success of these coordinated attacks. Each weapon system operated on preset frequencies that allowed commanders to shift fire rapidly as the tactical situation developed. M79 grenadiers could call for specific types of suppression, while engineers prepared demolition charges. Tank commanders could coordinate with Ontos crews to ensure that friendly fire did not interfere with precision breaching shots. Infantry squad leaders could direct flamethrower teams to specific rooms while maintaining overall control of the assault. The first full test of this coordinated system came during the assault on the provincial headquarters building on February 5th. The North Vietnamese had fortified this structure with particular care, knowing its symbolic importance and tactical value. Multiple automatic weapons positions covered all approaches, while snipers in upper floors could engage any Marines who tried to cross the open ground around the building. Cheatham positioned 2 M48 tanks to provide suppressive fire from different angles, ensuring that enemy gunners could not concentrate their attention on any single threat. The Ontos took position 300 yards away with a clear line of sight to the building's main entrance, while assault teams prepared to move on command. The attack began with the tanks engaging known enemy positions with high explosive rounds, forcing the defenders to take cover while the Ontos lined up its shot. The .50 caliber spotting round struck the reinforced entrance with surgical precision, followed immediately by an HEPI round that blew a gaping hole through 2 feet of masonry and steel reinforcement. Before the dust had settled, the assault team was moving. Engineers widened the breach with satchel charges, while flamethrower teams engaged the stairwells leading to upper floors. Rifle squads poured through the opening, clearing rooms methodically while maintaining communication with supporting weapons outside. The entire sequence from initial bombardment to building secured took less than 20 minutes. More importantly, Marine casualties were minimal, 2 wounded, none killed, compared to previous assaults that had cost multiple lives without achieving their objectives. The enemy position that had held up an entire company for 3 days had been reduced to rubble and cleared in less time than it took most units to plan a single assault. Word of the successful technique spread rapidly through Marine units fighting in southern Hue. By February 6th, Cheatham had organized multiple assault teams using the same combination of weapons and tactics. The provincial headquarters, city prison, and main hospital all fell to coordinated attacks that followed the same pattern. Ontos breach, immediate assault, systematic clearing. The North Vietnamese found themselves facing a tactical problem they had not anticipated. Their defensive strategy depended on using Hue's architecture as armor, turning every building into a fortress that could hold up American advances for hours or days. But the Ontos-led assault teams were reducing their strongest positions in minutes, moving from building to building with a speed that prevented the defenders from reorganizing their lines. The psychological effect on both sides was profound. Marines who had spent days watching their comrades die in futile assaults against impregnable positions suddenly found themselves winning decisive victories with acceptable casualties. The enemy soldiers who had felt secure behind massive walls discovered that their strongest defenses could be breached in seconds by weapons they had never encountered before. As the fighting moved block by block through southern Hue, Cheatham refined his techniques based on lessons learned in each engagement. Some buildings required multiple HEP rounds to create breaches large enough for assault teams. Others needed extensive use of flamethrowers to clear defenders from basement positions that could not be reached with conventional weapons. Each successful assault provided data that made the next attack more efficient and more deadly. By the end of the first week of February, the Marines had retaken most of the government buildings south of the Perfume River, using tactics that would have been considered impossible just days earlier. The weapon that the Army had discarded as unsuitable for modern warfare had become the key to American success in Vietnam's most important urban battle. The Perfume River crossing on February 18th presented Cheatham with a tactical puzzle that would test every lesson learned in the southern city. The ancient citadel loomed across the water like a medieval fortress transplanted into the 20th century, its massive walls rising from the morning mist with a permanence that had intimidated attackers for over a century and a half. Intelligence reports estimated that 2 battalions of North Vietnamese regulars had fortified positions throughout the citadel's interior, turning the sprawling complex into a maze of interconnected strongpoints that could support each other with overlapping fields of fire. The crossing itself had been accomplished under cover of darkness by 1st Battalion, 5th Marines, but their foothold remained precarious. The Marines controlled only a narrow strip of ground along the southeastern wall, hemmed in by enemy positions that commanded every approach route. Unlike the government buildings in southern Hue, which had been constructed as administrative centers, the citadel had been designed from the ground up as a military fortress. Every corner had been planned to channel attackers into kill zones, every wall positioned to provide mutual support with neighboring positions. Colonel Stanley Hughes, commanding the 1st Marine Regiment, had studied the problem for hours before authorizing the expanded assault. The citadel covered nearly 4 square miles, surrounded by walls that averaged 20 feet in height and 6 feet in thickness at the base. The moat that encircled the entire complex stretched 90 feet across in most places, filled with stagnant water that would bog down any vehicle attempting to cross. Inside the walls, traditional Vietnamese architecture created a secondary maze of courtyards and compounds, each capable of independent defense. The North Vietnamese had prepared their positions with methodical precision. Automatic weapons nests covered every street and alley leading into the citadel's interior. Mortar teams positioned in the central courtyards could drop rounds on any Marine position along the walls. Sniper teams in the higher buildings maintained constant observation of American movements, calling in fire missions whenever Marines attempted to concentrate for an assault. Most critically, the enemy had positioned anti-tank teams at key choke points, armed with B-40 rocket-propelled grenades capable of destroying any armored vehicle that ventured into the narrow passages. The solution that emerged from planning sessions between Hughes and Cheatham represented a scaling up of the tactics that had proven successful in southern Hue, but with modifications dictated by the unique challenges of fortress warfare. The citadel's massive walls could not be breached by conventional explosives or small arms fire. Even the 90mm guns of M48 tanks produced only superficial damage against masonry that had been designed to withstand siege artillery from the Napoleonic era. But the walls also presented opportunities that had not existed in the southern city. Their height and thickness meant that enemy positions behind them were completely isolated from mutual support once Marines established firing positions on top. The regular spacing of gates and towers created predictable strongpoints that could be engaged systematically rather than requiring the building-by-building clearing that had characterized the earlier fighting. The assault plan that Hughes approved called for multiple simultaneous attacks designed to overwhelm the enemy's ability to coordinate their defense. South Vietnamese forces would advance through the center of the citadel toward the Forbidden City, drawing enemy attention and fixing their reserves in defensive positions. Vietnamese Marine Corps units would assault the western wall, threatening to cut off enemy escape routes toward the countryside. Meanwhile, 1st Battalion, 5th Marines would push along the southeastern wall, supported by every available Ontos and recoilless rifle in the Marine inventory. The key to success lay in the precise coordination of direct-fire weapon systems, each contributing specific capabilities to the overall assault. M48 tanks would provide suppressive fire with their 90mm guns, engaging known enemy positions with high explosive rounds, while advancing infantry took cover. The tank's primary mission was not to breach walls, but to keep enemy heads down during the critical moments when assault teams moved across open ground. Ontos vehicles would handle the precision breaching mission that had proven so effective in southern Hue. Their 106mm HEP rounds could create clean holes in masonry walls at ranges up to 500 yards, well beyond the effective range of most enemy anti-tank weapons. More importantly, the Ontos could engage multiple targets in rapid succession, firing up to 6 rounds before requiring the vulnerable reloading process that exposed crews to enemy fire. Tripod-mounted 106mm recoilless rifles provided additional flexibility for engaging targets that vehicles could not reach effectively. These weapons could be positioned in upper-story windows or on rooftops, giving them angles of fire that bypassed many of the enemy's prepared defenses. Their crews could also displace rapidly between firing positions, making it difficult for enemy mortar teams to target them effectively. The first test of this coordinated system came during the assault on the southeastern gate complex on February 19th. The North Vietnamese had fortified this position with particular care, recognizing its importance as a potential breach point in their defensive perimeter. Multiple machine gun positions covered the approaches, while mortar teams could drop rounds on any Marines who attempted to concentrate near the walls. The attack began before dawn, with A-4 Skyhawk aircraft from Marine Fighter Attack Squadron 311, delivering precision strikes on known enemy positions. The pilots faced the delicate challenge of providing close air support within 800 meters of friendly forces, closer than normal safety margins allowed, but necessary given the confined nature of urban combat. Each bombing run had to be coordinated precisely with ground controllers to avoid hitting Marine positions that were often separated from enemy strongpoints by less than a city block. As the aircraft completed their runs, the ground assault commenced with textbook precision. 2 M48 tanks moved into overwatch positions, engaging the gate complex with high explosive rounds that forced enemy gunners to take cover. The suppressive fire created a brief window during which an Ontos crew could maneuver to a firing position with clear sight lines to the target. The Ontos engaged the gate structure with devastating effect. 3 HEP rounds fired in rapid succession blew gaping holes through masonry that had withstood monsoon storms and tropical heat for over a century. Each impact sent shockwaves through the ancient stonework, causing sections of wall to collapse inward and creating multiple breach points for assault teams. But the enemy response demonstrated why the citadel had remained unconquered for so long. As soon as the Ontos revealed its position by firing, mortar rounds began falling around the vehicle with alarming accuracy. North Vietnamese observers had pre-plotted likely firing positions and could call for indirect fire within seconds of detecting muzzle flashes. The Ontos crew found themselves under intense bombardment, forced to displace rapidly while assault teams prepared to exploit the breaches they had created. The infantry assault that followed showcased the evolution of Marine urban warfare tactics since the beginning of the battle. Assault teams moved through the breaches with equipment specifically tailored for fortress fighting. Engineers carried larger satchel charges than had been used in Southern Hue, recognizing that the citadel's construction required more explosive power to achieve the same effects. Flamethrower teams brought additional fuel supplies, knowing that the complex internal structure of traditional Vietnamese compounds would require extensive burning to clear all defensive positions. The clearing process inside the gate complex revealed both the strengths and limitations of the enemy's defensive strategy. North Vietnamese soldiers had prepared multiple fallback positions within the same structure, connected by tunnels and protected passageways that allowed them to reoccupy areas that Marines thought they had cleared. Each room required individual attention from assault teams, while snipers in adjacent buildings maintained harassing fire on any Marines who exposed themselves in courtyards or open areas. The solution that emerged from this engagement would define Marine tactics for the remainder of the Citadel battle. Rather than attempting to clear buildings completely before moving on to the next objective, assault teams would breach multiple structures simultaneously, forcing the enemy to defend too many positions at once. Ontos vehicles and recoilless rifles would create breaches faster than enemy soldiers could relocate to defend them, while infantry followed up immediately to prevent reoccupation. This approach required unprecedented coordination between weapon systems operating at different ranges and with different capabilities. Ontos crews had to communicate constantly with infantry commanders to ensure that breaching fires did not interfere with assault preparations. Tank commanders needed real-time updates on enemy positions to provide effective suppressive fire without endangering friendly forces moving through breach points. Recoilless rifle teams required precise target designations to avoid wasting ammunition on structures that were already neutralized. The radio networks that made this coordination possible represented a significant evolution from standard Marine communication procedures. Each weapon system operated on designated frequencies that allowed rapid target handoffs and fire coordination. Forward observers attached to assault teams could call for specific types of support while maintaining overall tactical control. Company and battalion commanders could monitor multiple engagements simultaneously, shifting resources as tactical situations developed. By February 22nd, this coordinated system had enabled Marines to seize the entire southeastern section of the Citadel wall. The advance had cost 37 Marine casualties, a significant number, but far fewer than would have been expected for an assault on prepared positions of such strength. More importantly, the Marines had demonstrated that even the most formidable fortifications could be reduced by weapons and tactics that maximized the strengths of each system while minimizing individual vulnerabilities. Colonel Hughes's assessment of the fighting would become part of Marine Corps doctrine for urban warfare. The combination of tanks, Ontos, and recoilless rifles provided the direct fire punch that made the Palace assault possible. The 106mm recoilless rifle, particularly when mounted on the Ontos vehicle, had proven itself the single most effective supporting weapon for fortress warfare. Its ability to create precise breaches at standoff ranges while operating in confined spaces made it indispensable for the type of fighting that characterized the Citadel battle. As Marines consolidated their positions along the captured wall sections, they could see the next phase of the battle taking shape. The Forbidden City lay before them, its ornate buildings and sacred courtyards representing the ultimate prize in the fight for Hue. The enemy still controlled the approaches and had demonstrated their willingness to fight for every room and every wall. But the Marines now possessed both the weapons and the tactics necessary to continue their advance, turning obstacles into opportunities with a combination of firepower and precision that the defenders could not match. The fatal flaw in the Ontos design revealed itself at the worst possible moment on February 20th, when Sergeant Mike Rodriguez found himself staring at 6 empty breach mechanisms, while North Vietnamese soldiers poured automatic weapons fire from a fortified compound barely 50 yards away. His vehicle had just delivered devastating salvos against 3 separate enemy positions, creating the breaches that allowed Marines to advance 2 blocks deeper into the Citadel. But now, with his ammunition exhausted and enemy reinforcements moving to counterattack, Rodriguez faced the nightmare scenario that had convinced the army to abandon the Ontos program entirely. To reload his weapons, Rodriguez would have to climb out of the vehicle's protective armor and expose himself to enemy fire while manually inserting fresh rounds into each of the 6 breach mechanisms. The process required him to stand on the vehicle's rear deck, completely visible to enemy observers, while handling heavy ammunition under combat conditions. Each 106mm round weighed 27 pounds and had to be aligned precisely with its corresponding breach mechanism, a task that demanded steady hands and careful attention to detail under the best of circumstances. The design engineers who had created the Ontos in the 1950s had recognized this vulnerability, but had accepted it as the price for mounting 6 recoilless rifles on a chassis light enough for air transport. Conventional tank designs stored ammunition inside armored compartments where loaders could work under protection, but the Ontos's lightweight construction left no room for internal storage of the oversized rounds required by 106mm recoilless rifles. The trade-off had seemed acceptable when the vehicle was intended for hit-and-run attacks against Soviet armor in European forests. In the confined streets of Hue, it became a potentially fatal liability. Rodriguez's crew had experienced this vulnerability during training exercises at Camp Pendleton, but never under the intensity of actual combat. The standard drill called for one crew member to provide security while another handled the reloading process, but enemy fire could make this division of labor impossible to maintain. When B-40 rockets started impacting around their position and small arms fire began chipping concrete from nearby walls, the textbook procedures became academic exercises with no bearing on survival. The solution that Rodriguez improvised in those desperate moments would become standard practice for Ontos crews throughout the remainder of the Hue battle. Instead of attempting to reload all 6 weapons simultaneously, he fired only 2 or 3 rounds during each engagement, keeping the remainder in reserve for exactly this type of situation. When forced to reload under fire, he could focus on replenishing the empty tubes while retaining some immediate firepower for self-defense. This tactical adaptation required fundamental changes in how Ontos crews engaged targets. Rather than delivering devastating 6-round salvos that could reduce entire buildings to rubble in seconds, crews learned to pace their fire to maintain continuous availability. The first rounds would create initial breaches, followed immediately by displacement to a covered position where reloading could occur safely. Additional rounds would then be used to widen breaches or engage secondary targets as the tactical situation developed. The displacement techniques that evolved from these constraints turned the Ontos' small size from a liability into a tactical advantage. Where M48 tanks required wide turning radii and could not reverse quickly when threatened, the Ontos could pivot in place and accelerate rapidly in any direction. Crews developed techniques for using building corners and debris piles as cover during the vulnerable reloading phase, positioning their vehicles so that enemy observers could not maintain direct fire on the ammunition handlers. Tank crews and infantry units quickly learned to provide covering fire during Ontos reloading operations. M60 machine guns would rake suspected enemy positions while crew members worked on the rear deck, and M79 grenade launchers would drop rounds on upper-story windows where snipers might be positioned. The coordination required split-second timing, with supporting weapons maintaining suppressive fire until the Ontos crew signaled readiness to resume operations. The most dangerous reloading situation occurred when Ontos vehicles became isolated from supporting units during rapid advances through enemy-held territory. Staff Sergeant David Chen experienced this nightmare scenario on February 21st when his vehicle outpaced the infantry advance and found itself surrounded by enemy positions in a courtyard complex near the Imperial Palace. His crew had expended 4 rounds creating multiple breaches, but enemy soldiers were already moving to reoccupy positions that Marines had not yet been able to clear. Chen's response demonstrated the tactical flexibility that experienced Ontos crews developed through necessity. Rather than attempting to reload in the exposed courtyard, he used his remaining 2 rounds to blast exit routes through walls that separated his position from friendly forces. The HEP rounds created clean holes through masonry barriers, allowing his vehicle to escape the trap while infantry units moved up to exploit the breaches he had created. This incident highlighted another critical adaptation in Ontos employment tactics. Crews learned to maintain constant communication with infantry commanders, ensuring that their fire missions supported immediate assault plans rather than creating isolated breaches that could not be exploited quickly. The vehicle's devastating firepower was most effective when integrated into coordinated attacks that combined breaching, suppression, and assault in rapid succession. The psychological pressure on Ontos crews during reloading operations created stress levels that few other combat arms experienced. Tank crews could remain inside their vehicles during ammunition resupply, protected by armor while handling rounds that were stored in internal compartments. Artillery crews operated at ranges that kept them beyond direct fire from most enemy weapons. But Ontos crewmen had to expose themselves repeatedly during combat, climbing out of their vehicles while under observation from enemy forces who had learned to target the reloading process specifically. Enemy tactics evolved to exploit this vulnerability as North Vietnamese commanders recognized the threat that Ontos vehicles posed to their defensive positions. Sniper teams received specific instructions to target crew members during reloading operations, while mortar teams pre-plotted likely firing positions where Ontos vehicles might take cover. Anti-tank teams with B-40 rocket-propelled grenades learned to wait until vehicles were stationary and crew members were exposed before revealing their positions. The countermeasures that Marine units developed to protect Ontos crews during reloading reflected the vehicle's critical importance to urban combat operations. Infantry squads would establish security perimeters around stationary vehicles, while tank crews provided overwatch from positions that could engage enemy observers. Engineers would create hasty fortifications using rubble and debris to shield ammunition handlers from direct fire, while forward air controllers maintained close air support on call to suppress enemy positions that threatened reloading operations. The ammunition supply chain for Ontos operations required modifications to standard Marine logistics procedures. Each vehicle consumed 106mm rounds at a rate that exceeded normal planning factors, particularly during intensive urban fighting where multiple engagements occurred within short time periods. Supply convoys had to risk movement through contested areas to maintain adequate ammunition stocks, while forward supply points required protection from enemy indirect fire and ground attacks. Technical innovations emerged from crew-level modifications to improve reloading efficiency under combat conditions. Some crews welded additional handles to ammunition rounds to improve grip during hasty reloading procedures. Others modified their vehicles with improvised shields that provided partial protection for crew members working on the rear deck. These field expedients reflected the reality that official doctrine had not anticipated the sustained urban combat conditions that characterized the Hue battle. The training implications of Ontos employment in urban warfare became apparent as replacement crews arrived from the United States with preparation that emphasized anti-tank warfare in open terrain. The techniques required for fortress fighting against prepared positions bore little resemblance to the hit-and-run tactics taught at Marine training facilities. Experienced crews began conducting informal instruction for new arrivals, passing on lessons learned through combat that could not be replicated in peacetime exercises. By the final week of February, Ontos crews had developed standard operating procedures that maximized their vehicles' effectiveness while minimizing exposure during vulnerable reloading phases. These techniques would be incorporated into Marine Corps doctrine for urban warfare, but their immediate impact was measured in tactical success rather than bureaucratic recognition. The weapons that had been discarded as unsuitable for modern warfare had not only proven their worth in combat, but had evolved through necessity into something approaching their full potential. The adaptation process that transformed the Ontos from a liability into an asset reflected broader changes in Marine Corps tactical thinking during the Hue battle. Equipment that appeared obsolete or flawed in peacetime exercises revealed unexpected capabilities when employed by innovative commanders facing unprecedented challenges. The vehicle that could not meet Army specifications for conventional warfare had become indispensable for the type of fighting that would define urban combat for decades to come. The silence that settled over the Imperial Palace on February 26th carried a weight that no amount of artillery bombardment had achieved in 26 days of continuous fighting. For the first time since the battle began, the ancient courtyards lay empty of gunfire. The ornate buildings stood without muzzle flashes winking from their windows, and the sacred halls that had housed Vietnamese emperors for over a century were finally free of combat. The cost of this silence stretched across the entire city, like a monument to urban warfare's brutality. More than 116,000 civilians had fled their homes during the fighting, carrying whatever possessions they could manage, while artillery shells and rocket-propelled grenades turned their neighborhoods into moonscapes of rubble and twisted metal. The Red Cross estimated that over 80% of the city's structures had sustained damage ranging from broken windows to complete destruction. Entire blocks had been reduced to skeletal frameworks of concrete and steel, while others showed the characteristic 4-meter square holes that marked where Ontos vehicles had punched through walls that had stood for generations. Lieutenant Colonel Cheatham walked through the ruins of what had once been the citadel's southeastern section, surveying the transformation that his tactical innovations had wrought. Every corner bore evidence of the breaching techniques that had evolved from desperate improvisation into systematic doctrine. Buildings that had seemed impregnable just weeks earlier now stood perforated by precisely placed holes, their ancient masonry defeated by weapons that military planners had considered obsolete. The human cost of the victory sobered even the most hardened Marines. 221 Americans had died in the fighting, while South Vietnamese losses exceeded 400. North Vietnamese and Viet Cong casualties remained uncounted, but intelligence estimates suggested that the enemy had lost over 5,000 soldiers defending a city they had hoped to hold indefinitely. The streets that had once bustled with merchants and students now lay empty except for rubble and the occasional patrol checking for unexploded ordnance. But the tactical revolution that had made this victory possible carried implications that extended far beyond the immediate battle. The Marines had proven that modern urban warfare required weapons and techniques that bore little resemblance to the tank versus tank combat that had dominated military thinking since World War II. The assumption that heavy armor represented the ultimate expression of battlefield firepower had been shattered by the reality of fighting in confined spaces against enemies who understood how to use architecture as armor. The final assault on the Imperial Palace itself had demonstrated the full evolution of marine urban warfare tactics. South Vietnamese forces had been designated to conduct the actual seizure of the sacred buildings, recognizing the political sensitivity of having foreign troops occupy the spiritual heart of Vietnamese culture. But marine tanks, Ontos, and recoilless rifles had provided the direct fire support that made the assault possible, engaging specific defensive positions with surgical precision to avoid the wholesale destruction that conventional artillery would have caused. The careful coordination required for this final phase reflected months of tactical development under combat conditions. Each weapon system had found its optimal role in the urban warfare environment. M48 tanks provided suppressive fire and mobile cover for advancing infantry, their 90mm guns capable of engaging multiple targets rapidly, while their armor protected crews from the small arms fire that dominated street fighting. But their real value lay in psychological impact rather than precision destruction. The sight and sound of tank fire kept enemy heads down during critical moments when assault teams crossed open ground. Ontos vehicles had become the precision instruments of urban warfare, capable of creating exactly the type of breach that infantry needed without causing unnecessary collateral damage. Their 106mm HEPI rounds could punch clean holes through the thickest masonry walls at ranges that kept crews beyond effective small arms fire, while their mobility allowed rapid displacement between firing positions. The 6-gun salvos that had initially seemed like the vehicle's primary advantage had given way to more subtle applications that emphasized surgical breaching over raw firepower. Tripod-mounted recoilless rifles had proven invaluable for engaging targets that vehicles could not reach effectively, particularly enemy positions in upper stories of buildings where elevation and angle restrictions limited tank and Ontos effectiveness. These weapons could be man-packed to rooftop positions or positioned in windows that provided clear sight lines to specific targets, adding flexibility to the direct fire arsenal that made systematic clearing operations possible. The integration of these weapons with conventional infantry tactics had required innovations that would influence marine doctrine for decades. Forward observers learned to coordinate multiple fire missions simultaneously, calling for specific types of suppression while maintaining overall tactical control. Engineers developed techniques for expanding Ontos-created breaches using shaped charges and conventional explosives, ensuring that initial holes could be widened rapidly to accommodate assault teams carrying heavy equipment. Flamethrower teams refined their room-clearing procedures to maximize effectiveness in the complex internal layouts of traditional Vietnamese architecture. Colonel Hughes's post-battle assessment would become a cornerstone of Marine Corps urban warfare doctrine. If any single supporting arm can be given credit for the success of the operation, it would have to be the 106mm recoilless rifle, particularly the M50 Ontos. This judgment reflected not just the weapon's technical capabilities, but its role in proving that unconventional solutions often provided the keys to seemingly impossible tactical problems. The broader implications of the Hue battle extended beyond immediate tactical lessons to fundamental questions about military procurement and doctrine development. The Army's decision to cancel Ontos production had been based on rigorous analysis of the vehicle's performance in conventional warfare scenarios, but those analyses had failed to anticipate the type of fighting that would characterize future conflicts. The urban warfare environment that had emerged during the Vietnam War demanded weapons optimized for precision rather than mass destruction, mobility rather than heavy armor, and surgical capability rather than overwhelming firepower. The Marines who had made the Ontos effective in urban combat had not simply employed the weapon as designed, but had adapted its capabilities through innovation born of necessity. The reload under fire techniques that crews developed to overcome the vehicle's most serious design flaw reflected broader principles of tactical adaptation under combat stress. Equipment that appeared fundamentally flawed in peacetime testing revealed unexpected potential when operated by soldiers who understood both its limitations and its unique capabilities. The psychological impact of the Ontos on both American and enemy forces provided another dimension to its battlefield effectiveness. Marine morale had improved dramatically once crews learned to create reliable breaches in enemy fortifications, transforming the grinding attrition of urban warfare into a series of tactical problems with achievable solutions. Conversely, North Vietnamese defenders found themselves facing a weapon system they had not encountered before, and for which their tactical doctrine provided no effective countermeasures. The intelligence reports that emerged from prisoner interrogations revealed the enemy's growing concern about American breaching capabilities as the battle progressed. North Vietnamese commanders had planned their defense around the assumption that thick masonry walls would provide protection against conventional weapons, but the Ontos had made their strongest positions vulnerable to attack. The realization that no fortification was safe from precision breaching had undermined enemy confidence and contributed to the psychological pressure that ultimately made their position untenable. The final statistics of Ontos employment during the Hue battle told the story of a weapon system that had exceeded every expectation. The vehicles had fired over 800 106mm rounds during the course of the fighting, creating hundreds of precise breaches that enabled infantry advances. More importantly, they had done so with remarkably low friendly casualties, proving that surgical firepower could achieve tactical objectives that conventional weapons accomplished only through massive destruction. As the last Marine patrols cleared the final enemy positions and South Vietnamese forces prepared to occupy the Imperial Palace, the transformation of American urban warfare capabilities was complete. The weapon that had been discarded as ugly and useless had become the linchpin of victory in one of the most challenging battles of the Vietnam War. The numbers, not the legend, had carried the day, proving that innovation and adaptation could turn apparent weaknesses into decisive advantages when applied by soldiers who understood the true nature of their mission.